the visionary mystic, the lover, the unitive mystic, and the iconoclast.
You're listening to the Contemplative Light podcast with your host, Clint Sabon.
This podcast is brought to you by Contemplative Light and our online classes. We currently still have available a class on the essentials of Christian mysticism. It includes contemplative practices and contemplative perspectives on the mystic tradition in Christianity. And you can find that at contemplativelight.com/classes, or just go to our main page and click on classes at contemplativelight.com. Hey, and welcome to episode number 13 for the Contemplative Light podcast. And this is a talk on the Christian mystics. We have a course coming up on the Christian mystics, and we've been busy kind of researching and talking about it. And Christian mystics has kind of been the theme for Contemplative Light in the first half or first quarter of this year in 2018. And it's been a lot of fun, and Mark's going to join me on this episode. Mark Shaw, co-founder of Contemplative Light, he's going to join me and talk a little bit about some of the research he's been doing on the Christian mystics. He seems to have had some really interesting epiphanies and going about, contemplating the Christian mystics and putting together this course. So I think you're going to really get a lot out of what he says. And it's a good overview. This podcast is a good overview, I think, for anybody that just wants to know about the Christian mystics and get a sense of them. So this is a good podcast for that. The Contemplative Light podcast explores the process of inner transformation through the lens of mystical traditions, both ancient and modern. Contemplative Light is a community of inner spiritual writers and teachers with contemplative perspectives committed to helping others experience lasting inner transformation through disciplined mystical practices. Contemplative Light, mystical practice, inner transformation. And here is the talk with Mark on the Christian mystics. Enjoy.
Hey, Mark, how are you?
Hi, Clint. I'm doing well. Thank you.
Well, thanks for doing a podcast today. We are working on our Christian Mystics course, and we certainly had a lot of fans and readers that were interested in the Christian Mystics as a possible course. And, I guess we had a little bit of a decision there, deciding which mystics to include and not include, and maybe it came down to somewhat, at least, who we actually felt like researching ourselves and really talking about ourselves. So you've looked into a good bit of them already, and then you even had some initial thoughts on kind of putting the Christian mystics in kind of a large overall picture throughout, I guess, history or the development of church history. So I guess any thoughts you want to share with that would be great.
Yeah, man. The content is so fresh, and I'm so kind of immersed in it that the challenge is actually not going to be to how to get enough content out of this episode, but really how to condense it into a manageable time frame and kind of hopefully make it concise and intelligent. For listeners, I think a couple things that I definitely want to touch on. First is, like you mentioned, that introductory sort of context that is also, some of which I'll go into at a little more elaborate length at the beginning of the course as a kind of introductory segment for the course. But I want to touch on some amount of that context. I also want to touch on a little bit about having researched and given these lectures some of the surprising aspects, kind of in hindsight, having done it now, what some of the realizations. And then thirdly, want to touch on in this episode some sort of unique value propositions that I think we offer in our course as an intro to the Christian mystics that's really going to be helpful for some of our listeners and readers.
Oh, great. That all sounds fantastic. So I'm curious myself as to some of these things, especially the introductory context and how you would kind of frame that.
Right. So part of that, I really had to go back to as a sort of framing device to one of the scholars that you and I first connected on in this field, and her, kind of perennial touchstone that's simply titled Mysticism, and that's Evelyn Underhill. And she has so much. She's such a synthesizer of this stuff, thought deeply about it, has sort of immersed herself not just in the practice and the life, but the study of. And that I think is pretty unique, and there's so much to kind of draw on with her that I really used some of her writing as a guide. And even down to what is mysticism, defining the terms. There's different writers in the field, like a Thomas Merton, like a Carl McColman, like an Evelyn Underhill, that you want to give some sort of concise, simple definition. And it kind of comes down to those figures throughout the Christian tradition who lived an awakened life, the aim of which is divine union, that were somehow awakened into direct contact with the absolute, and that had some deeper insight into the spiritual trajectory toward divine union. But that seems to be a kind of guidepost or omega point in this whole discussion on Christian mysticism, is this movement toward divine union. So that became a kind of organizing principle amongst these sort of diverse voices in trying to get a hold of the bundle. And then another thing that she touched on, which was hugely valuable for me, was a sense of three distinct historical periods that were these significant eras of sort of mystical flowering, and that these could kind of be given some amount of label and really kind of take hold in the mind to be able to categorize and understand some of what these mystics were saying. And those three eras are roughly categorized as the classical mystics in the 3rd to even up to the 5th century, but these kind of, inheritors of the church fathers. These are people who are alive kind of just after, or in some cases during kind of Constantine, when Christianity is becoming the official religion of the empire, and they're trying to work out what that means, and closing the canon, and defining who's in, who's out, and what's heretical and what's orthodox, and kind of all that is going on, and yet there is this return to kind of a mystical awareness of the divine presence among some of the writers. And so the classical mystics around the 3rd century is one set of this flowering of an era. And then down the line, in the 14th century, some of these ancient texts and teachings are rediscovered. And there's this kind of second flowering in what we call the medieval mystics. and sort of a smattering, and then leading up to the 14th century, roughly, there's this second era.
Like a Renaissance?
Kind of, in a sense, it's just late. This is sort of high medieval. It's really the Renaissance is coming, but a third group of the post-Renaissance mystics, and that's an interesting point that Evelyn Underhill makes, is that whenever there is a cultural flowering of learning, of art, of new understanding, developments in science, and new breakthroughs, on the tail end of that comet are the mystics. It's as if, as a lot of the mystics describe, for example, Bonaventure has this metaphor of the 6 wings of the seraph. And those correspond to sort of the 6 movements of the soul. First in the outer world of perception, then in the world of the mind and intelligence, and then the spiritual perception of God. And then that's capped off, almost like the 7th day of creation, with a mystical awareness and divine union. And so kind of just like that ascent up the ladder, there seems to be, or Evelyn Underhill posits anyway, that there's this movement of learning through the kind of physical, then through the mind, then through kind of spiritual and religious flowering, and then that's always kind of capped off by some emergence or manifestation of mystical awareness as a kind of capstone or highest in human achievement or opening of consciousness, in a sense. So I thought it was extremely interesting that there were those 3 movements, the classical, the medieval, and then in the 17th century, that post-Renaissance period. But it was just interesting to dive in and get a sense of some of the historical context for each of those, and then kind of unpack that in the courses. So, for example, in that 14th century, in that medieval period, this is on the tail end of a shift from, the nobility and all the wealth being concentrated among the nobility to urbanization, the rise of a merchant class, new status symbols of wealth, and this sort of cultural norm of wealth and prosperity coming through individual effort. And at the same time, like a rise in literacy, and there's a broader audience for reading. And then at the same time, this shift from divine texts being kind of exclusively in Latin and communicated at Mass to now, because there's a new readership and reading class, that mystics start writing in the vernacular, and that those writings are being kind of disseminated among the laity, that not everything is coming through this official channel of church and getting an official Orthodox stamp. And so some of those social conditions creating, facilitating this movement, especially of this kind of second flowering of mystics in Europe.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So what about the ones after that? The third way.
Yeah, so the ones after that is this post-Renaissance, or actually even sort of early modern mystics, who are, and this would be kind of a John of the Cross and a Teresa of Avila, who have a kind of who are drawn on a lot by contemporary thinkers because they are sort of synthesizable with a contemporary psychological language. And you can make connections, to the unconscious and Jung and Freud and what we know now as a kind of contemporary, what you and I certainly discussed as sort of the psycho-spiritual, and that these writers like a Teresa of Avila or a Joan of the Cross, you can kind of integrate into that vocabulary, language, and understanding, and kind of speak to a modern ear a little more closely, even though it's still through metaphor, symbol, poetry. It's a little more accessible, let's say. And they're working off of similar premises that you and I would. They're inhabiting, a heliocentric universe. They're writing, post rise of Protestantism. They're writing when the world has turned a little more towards science for truth claims, and they're kind of wrestling with all those realities around them, and so are a little closer to us in terms of worldview and experience.
Yeah. Now, going back to the beginning, let me ask you this. All that having said, does that match up with your own experience of finding the more recent mystics more relatable? Like, do you find them more accessible?
So I think, whether it's reading Evelyn Underhill or Thomas Merton or Thomas Keating or Richard Rohr or those contemporary writers who, as a kind of purist and scholar and graduate of a seminary, there's this assumption that, if you go back to primary text, you'll get the real deal, and that modern teachers are a kind of after echo.
Yeah,
diminished
academia
version of the original.
Like that. Yeah.
And I really found the reverse to be true, that I needed the keys of contemporary teachers and the frameworks that they provide to make sense of these wide and varied writings and voices of the past. So it was really, then I know I have an interpretive framework, and I can see the connections of when they are aligned with kind of contemporary contemplative teachings and mystic, Christian mystics, where they speak into experience and where they align, and where they are kind of a little more of their own time and speaking to contemporary issues that and worldview and language that's a little more remote and removed. And so it really helps to kind of have some context from contemporary teachers to make the connections and also know sort of what rabbit holes to not go down.
Yeah, that certainly matches with my own experience too. And contemporary writers are sometimes good about just grounding things in just the ordinary, because you can end up reading some of these. You can end up reading some of these primary texts with the mystics, and you're not really sure like what exactly this is based on, I mean, it took me a long time to even realize, okay, so most of these mystics were like, they entered monasteries, they were doing a lot of prayer, they might have had a lot of time alone in these kinds of contemplative practices. I mean, you could read some of these primary texts, and if you didn't really have the context of monastic life or just daily contemplative practices, you wouldn't necessarily get that from the way they wrote. And I guess I'm even thinking of somebody like Pseudo-Dionysius, who was like, who writes all this stuff about like almost the architecture of and the metaphysics of the spiritual world and the earthly world and different kinds of rituals and stages, but yeah, I mean, it's really hard to picture, wonder what that guy's doing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
You would never get that from the way he wrote. So.
And that's a great point, and that came home when I was doing the research for Richard of St. Victor. And you are, as an interpreter of their texts and their writing and trying to wrap your head around what they were talking about, their influences, whether in his case, Augustine or Anselm, and how he's interacting with and responding to and differentiating himself from some of their teachings. In his case, he was still preaching. He was going through the daily office. He was, very much a member of a monastic community, first and foremost. And then in the spare time that wasn't devoted to community life, preaching, and prayer, he was developing these ideas. And it was, important to kind of keep in mind not just the kind of social context, but the life situation of these mystics and kind of what they were up to. Because I think when you abstract an individual to just their teaching and writing, you can kind of pick and choose what to agree with and disagree with, what to respect, what not to respect among their writing, but rather trying to kind of get in the headspace and the life situation of these people and their lives made it that much more sort of awe-inspiring what they were able to achieve.
Sure, and it was material from which they were drawing, I guess. All their activities day to day were kind of almost the raw elements of probably what became their writing. There was a lot of experiential components to it, and just the life of someone in a monastery or in the church or doing work with others. And I think when you're in school, you had mentioned that earlier, there's almost a tendency to think of scholars as just drawing off of other people's books, just being in this pure world of ideas, whereas some of these mystics might have been almost something closer to, I don't know, self-help gurus in a sense. I mean, in the sense they're really doing work, they're really helping people and coming up with these ideas rather than being just purely philosophical. Yeah,
and I think that it's such an interesting and diverse field for a couple of those reasons. One, to kind of go back, in reading someone like, say, Bonaventure, who's writing in this scholastic mode, meaning for extended passages in his work, he's presenting the opposite point of view from what he's actually getting at and invoking authorities to get at it, and then presenting the opposite point of view and authorities to support that point of view, very much in that philosophical mode and kind of rigorous, logical, linear fashion and kind of scholastic method of reasoning. And so from the outside looking in, if you just kind of, skim or pick out passages to get a sense of someone's thought without any kind of framework in place, it'll be tough to make sense of because you don't know necessarily where you are at in someone's particular argument and what they're getting at. And you can have these lengthy passages that's actually shedding light on the opposite of what, he's trying to argue as part of his method. And yet someone like a Bonaventure, you can usually tell their mystical writings come later in life, toward the end of their body of work. It's as if they're kind of fighting and reasoning themselves into a corner, and then they recognize the limitation of thought and reason and theological method, and then have to kind of make that turn from the cataphatic or positive theology to apophatic and negative, having recognized their limitation.
Yeah. Aquinas was the same way, wasn't he? Aquinas was associated with scholasticism,
right?
And then it wasn't until later in his life to where he kind of got more contemplative, or almost ended up just wanting to burn all of his work, forget it all.
Right, because of, in the context, if you do have that taste of the absolute, you recognize the kind of transience or relative truth or ultimate kind of meaninglessness, because the words and language and concepts can never quite capture. All they can do is make distinctions and categorize, whereas that experience of the absolute is then, maybe opens the door to this abundant divine love through faith, or however they articulate it, that is somehow something wholly other than this kind of philosophizing around that really doesn't move the needle in terms of spiritual insight. And then that stands in contrast to these figures like a Hildegard or a Mechtild of Magdeburg or a Julian of Norwich, who seem to have these visions and revelations from a young age and are somehow attuned to the holy and kind of immersed in the divine. And it's just a question for them of how much of that they want to reveal to others and how, or whether that's going to be officially sanctioned or not, versus more left-wing types. Yeah.
And that's probably a relevant theme today too, as far as some of the gender discussions, because I think there was probably a sense that the men of those eras were probably tending to be more heady and philosophical and academic and theological, and have a whole lot of fancy paradigms in their writings, and a lot of the female mystics seemed like it was just kind of more of a direct emotional experience, but at the same time they kind of needed the approval of the male figures of the church so they didn't get burned. And so it was kind of a matter of trying to integrate that. Although I guess, of course, a lot of the male mystics in the Middle Ages had some issues with that, as did John of the Cross, with trying to, that's probably a common theme always mystics continue to have, even today. I think that a lot of Christian mystics probably could go to plenty of churches that wouldn't consider them true Christians because of their mystical orientation. But anyways, not to follow down that tangential rabbit hole, but because I wanted to get back to this scholastic thing. You'd mentioned scholasticism, and I brought in Bonaventure, and I brought up Aquinas. Real quick, how would you even describe scholasticism? Like what exactly is scholasticism? It's not necessarily like, because you hear scholastic, you think, well, that really good student, they did all their homework, really studied for the test. They were very scholastic, but that's not exactly what it meant in that context. So how would you describe it?
So it was the application of this particular scholastic method as a means of arriving at truth, which is, kind of a watershed moment coming out of a medieval period where there's not this widespread literacy, there's not widespread education. You certainly don't have peer-reviewed, journals in the sciences. A lot of writing and quote, accepted truth is conjecture and speculation, but the scholastics kind of give a preview of the modern era where you have to, rigorously kind of prove your point. Now, it wasn't yet to where it is today with it has to be sort of empirical evidence is the highest form of proof, but authority in their time still kind of counts. But the scholastic method essentially is I present one point of view, then I present the opposite point of view, then I summarize. So the shorthand for that has become, thesis, antithesis, synthesis as a means of sort of moving toward truth. And they could invoke the Bible as authority or accepted teachers like an Aristotle or an Augustine, whom everybody agreed by a kind of consensus were authority subject. And so within the universities, they had a rigorous method of arriving at truth through this, at times kind of tedious or laborious or ongoing method of argumentation. And in part because they didn't have shared implied body of knowledge, they had to be extremely thorough in listing all the things that they did and didn't mean and what they were and weren't talking about. So you get these sort of lengthy tomes of an Aquinas or a Bonaventure, but very sort of rigorous minds at work, but kind of laying the foundations for what would become a kind of scientific method or scholarship.
Sure. Yeah, that definitely resonates with a lot of the way scholarly writing is still done, I think.
So this is our mid-roll commercial break where we would ideally have a big corporation paying us tons of money for an advertisement, but instead we're going to have a commercial for my YouTube channel. You can go to Clint Sabom at YouTube, or there's a YouTube link to my channel on contemplativelight.com. I've been into making videos. You might like them. You might not, but check it out.
So let's, I'm trying to think, your original three things you were going to do. The first one was what? The introductory context and the different waves, and then the last one was the value proposition. What was the one in the middle? The surprises. Yes, that's what it was. What were the big surprises that you've come across?
Prior to that, to kind of round off the introductory conversation you and I had, and this is kind of a teaser maybe for some listeners. We developed, given some of the literature in the Lit Review, we had 4 mystical types that we wanted to identify, and these aren't hard and fast. There's some amount of multiple categories that some of the mystics could fit in, but you and I wanted to establish as a kind of shorthand for understanding some of these different mystics and their experiences as the visionary mystic, the lever, the unitive mystic, and the iconoclast.
What was the third one?
The unitive.
Unitive. Okay, cool.
And in some sense, that it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. Some of the lover, the visionary also have kind of divine union as their goal, but maybe not so much as their main emphasis. So that was an interesting exercise of approaching a new mystic and kind of assigning them to one of those roles and categories and tracing those threads. But a couple of the surprises. So I think one thing was, you think about the Christian mystic, and what comes to mind is heresy and, this rigid orthodoxy that won't allow these kooky mystics with their divinely inspired visions to be heard, and they want to. I think we make this distinction too easily of the sort of lone voice of the divine iconoclast that is oppressed and silenced by the dogmatic tradition of this oppressed, church that wants to silence and any nonconformists, and that's a kind of ready-made narrative that we have. And certainly, I had that expectation with a couple of them, notably Meister Eckhart. And what I just found was, in any case, it was pretty soft. We kind of smushed together this idea of kind of the evils of the Spanish Inquisition and stamping out in really sort of projected heresies. But if you look at kind of in totality, if you look at the big picture, that just really wasn't the case as much as I had expected. A lot of these mystics were front and center in the kind of church hierarchy, were kind of respectable, leaders, and when they kind of ran afoul of the authorities, with a few exceptions, there was this ongoing process of them presenting sort of public defense or others coming to their aid in defense. Even someone who on the surface certainly, as an example, so the church I was raised in, if someone, came into the youth group and started teaching anywhere close to what Meister Eckhart was teaching, they would have been disallowed from the church campus or whatever. And we think back to the medieval era and we assume this rigid orthodoxy that would, not tolerate dissent. And really, there was a wider array of voices heard than we might expect. We assume monolithic church, either toe the line or suffer the consequences of, death or excommunication or whatever. And I really think in some cases we're a little more rigid in our theological tolerance, down to today.
So you're basically saying that the Dark Ages were more open-minded than the evangelical church you grew up in.
Yeah, which was, and I'm sure if you looked at the totality of that time, you would find, egregious examples that contradict what I'm saying. And certainly
right,
had
of course, yeah.
Wars between, and these bloody battles between Catholics and Protestants, and, the drowning of Anabaptists. You certainly had kind of in the Middle Ages, violence, sort of Christian on Christian crime, if you will. But I was expecting a lot more of that in these stories of the Christian mystics, and it's really not the main theme.
Well, it is an interesting way to reframe the past, too, because I think that, and this is very common, too, in integral circles of people that will look at, stages of history and stages of human development as mirroring some sort of progress of the growth of the individual consciousness that, we're basically on the front end right now, and, you go back and the collective consciousness was less evolved. But it's interesting, because hearing you talk right now, it almost seems that it would be just as easy to make the opposite point on a lot of levels, in a lot of ways, that there was, in a sense, more diversity, or there was more of an established place for some mystics, maybe. In a way, we don't have an established place for them in our society now. But yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting way, I think, to think about that time, because you're right. It's a pre-made narrative that you go back there and, you think it's all oppressive and now we're so much freer. But a lot of those real revolutionary visionaries, just in terms of the way they viewed reality, were part and parcel of the church and were accepted.
And some of the crackdown that came on some of them, like Eckhart later in life, was kind of conditionally framed in a function of some of the stuff that was going on. So, for example, there was an instability at the top of the church when the papacy moved from Rome to Avignon. And this is kind of a period of instability in general in the church. And so at the same time, like I said, there's this rise of the literate culture and these sort of lay movements. And there's a sense in the church that kind of full authority is kind of getting away from them. And so in a way, they want to make an example of Eckhart and bring him before tribunals on charges of heresy. But the interesting part of, in a sense at least, the interesting part of it is he had people come to his defense. He was not, like you might get today, like a quiet blogger who off by himself. He was a part of the church establishment and publicly declared point by point in a piece of writing called The Defense why he was not, unorthodox. And instead of being condemned and excommunicated, they took a unique route of identifying 28 passages that were either suspect or were outright, unorthodox statements. But he didn't have a chance to either recant or defend himself because he died while the process was happening. So this was super late in his life. This notion that he's this, voice of one in the wilderness, this kind of Christian mystic martyr that was speaking truth from the mountaintops that everyone was too ignorant to see is a little, it's a little more nuanced than that. There were some social conditions that brought about his condemnation. And then when the Dominicans, the order he was a part of, tried to reinstate his status as an Orthodox teacher in the 20th century, the Vatican said, there's no need. He was never condemned a heretic. It was just these 28 passages. And so that's an interesting kind of counter narrative that you find when you kind of scratch the surface a little, is that this kind of, arch iconoclast that we think of in Meister Eckhart, that the counterculture kind of latched onto in the 60s and 70s, and became this sort of linchpin to Eastern, maybe interfaith dialogue is one word for it, syncretism, if you're a little more critical, is really not quite this sort of shunned figure as we think of him, but really, even the Vatican made an official statement that there was no need to reinstate him since he was never declared unorthodox.
Right. Yeah, that is real interesting. And well, they didn't make him a saint, though. I guess that is what you could still say. Like, well, I mean, okay, maybe he's not a heretic, but I mean, come on, you need to make him a saint,
And another kind of surprise, if I can call it that, I want to kind of tease it out a little bit, is the consistent elements across, we're talking about, 1,500 years, so 1,500 years of mystics and their teachings that you and I are looking at, and some of the consistent components in there are kind of staggering, in the sense that, I come from a seminary education, so I went to Fuller Theological Seminary. And at the time I was there was this move to kind of critically evaluate pop culture from a theological perspective as a kind of linchpin to get back in on the kind of cultural conversations that were going on. So that was a big point of emphasis while I was there. And what you got there so oftentimes was, if you squint and kind of pull your eyes out of focus, then you can kind of make Jeremiah and Tupac and Ecclesiastes and the movies of Sam Mendes all kind of mean the same thing. And we can sprinkle some Eminem in there, and if we kind of fudge a little here and kind of pretend a little bit there, then we can kind of foist some similarities and make it all, part of some same, communication of truth.
So y'all were looking at positive aspects of pop culture that matched up with universal religious truths?
That's one way to articulate it. It was. That's probably a separate podcast that we should get to.
Yeah. I was going to say. Well, I'm glad you said that though, because I mean, immediately when I hear of like a seminary trying to put theological ideas in pop culture, I'm like having these flashes of like some of these like alt-right like tweeters on social media that are saying things like Hollywood's, full of Illuminati devil worshippers and all that stuff. So, I don't know where that was going. But you're basically trying to say you were seeing some analogous relationships between modern day artistic pop culture truths and universal truths, but it was probably more of a stretch. But the mystics match up a lot more than that did. Is that where you were getting at?
Right. So, offer some sort of third-party kind of macro-level scholarly view and make a kind of tenuous connection between these different, passages of Scripture and a given artist, and kind of try to synthesize it all and make a cogent point out of it in the seminary setting. But there was such a through line on a couple different aspects in these different mystics. And some of that is because they're drawing on each other. It's not quite like they all kind of plopped out of nowhere and said the same thing. There is certainly a sort of Neoplatonic strand. But then again, as soon as you kind of develop that category and categorize them as such, some of them were not educated. Some of them were educated in very different contexts. And they weren't all, scholastic, sent to the University of Paris reading Aristotle and Plotinus and kind of drawing the same conclusions. And so it is interesting that there is almost universally this sense that there's a limitation in our ability to reason and perceive, and that at some point we make this turn from affirmative or positive theology to the apophatic, and that whatever God is, and whatever a transcendent divine perfection is, it inevitably transcends our ability to grasp through language and concepts. And that at some point you have to approach that heartfully or faithfully or accept, and that we approach the divine through something beyond reason. And that is, there's different metaphors for that. And yet at the same time, this paradox, almost as a through line through all of them, we also have to exercise our will to become sort of fertile soil for that grace. And that the actual experience of the divine, the mystical moment, is always a grace. And yet we have this, if you have that calling toward the contemplative life, that we are sort of diligently cultivating the soil to receive that grace. And so is a fairly, for some of these writers, kind of a complex idea, and yet it's a pretty consistent one. And then secondly, that there is some sort of process of ascent or purification. You know, you and I have kind of used throughout the Contemplative Light's writing and teaching that Evelyn Underhill, her building off of Dionysius, the Areopagite, of purgation, illumination, and divine union. And there's some version of that with almost all of these, but sometimes it's 6 stages, sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 9, and there's different metaphors they use for it, sometimes through direct speech, sometimes through symbols, but there's this movement of the soul of becoming purified that the mystics articulate, that is kind of, on the one hand, sort of drawn by God, called by God, magnetically drawn through that by God, and yet on the other hand requires a sort of his will to consent to that process of purification. So I thought that through line, if you read attentively, that's not something you have to come in with as a preconceived notion and sort of impose it on these different mystics, but it's there in their writing as a kind of consistent thread.
Yes.
And then lastly, I think, is an emphasis on prayer as a diligent means of making that ongoing journey and that ascent. And different mystics at different times kind of mean different things when they say that. And so it can kind of be difficult to latch on, well, is Richard of St. Victor talking about the liturgy and the office and going through the daily process of kind of communal, the collective prayer? Yes, I suppose. Julian of Norwich, who's by herself as this anchoress in this tiny cell adjacent to a church and kind of sequestered and partitioned off. What does she mean by prayer or a life of prayer? And, some of the other mystics, Jacob Burma, do they mean the same thing by prayer? It turns out Meister Eckhart talks a lot about contemplative prayer versus kind of discursive prayer. And so that can be a little more difficult to get a consistent grasp on of what they mean by prayer. But they all almost invoke that as part of the sort of propulsion of, the engine that helps, us climb up the ladder.
Yeah, that's the mystical practice. That's the shorthand for their mystical practices, basically, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
And that does look different at the different times and eras.
Yeah. It is interesting because, I was thinking of our tagline for Contemplative Light, mystical practice, inner transformation. And then, you think of prayer and all the Christian mystics talking about prayer. And then you kind of think of, I guess today you have a lot of people talking about mindfulness, or you have other traditions maybe talking about meditation. But it seems like all the Christian mystics just basically use the word prayer in some form, but they weren't necessarily meaning like, get out a book and read the prayer out loud, or, hold hands with your neighbor and say, they could have been meaning that, and that could have been part of it. But I mean, it's almost like an umbrella term for all sorts of things, I guess. Yeah, right. I don't know. I mean, that's a big question. Does that there's not as much of a continuity on that, or it's just kind of harder to know?
So I think there is continuity in that it's so frequently invoked as necessary and essential for the ascent, that journey, that's kind of described in various ways by the different mystics. But what or how each of the mystics kind of define that particular, what prayer is to them, I think, it changes over time in different areas. So it's a little, unless they specifically get into it with any degree of specificity, which they generally don't, it can be a little more difficult to know what they mean by that. So it's interesting to, as I'm reading that, what I hear in the back of my head is an Anthony DeMello, who, when he's giving a lecture and someone says, well, when I pray, I do this. And he says, well, what I mean when I say prayer isn't necessarily the Lord, Lord, the verbal discursive prayer. It's more the resting in God. So he's just naturally assumes prayer means kind of contemplative prayer. And then Thomas Keating way, that prayer can mean, much more than kind of the verbal articulated. But those sort of finding those common components of the limitations of reason, the need for an apophatic turn, the sort of paradoxical, divine union as a grace, but maintaining, a receptive space for that as a diligent practice, and this metaphor of the ascent to God in various forms and fashions, and then prayer as a means of bringing that movement about, I thought was very striking, that there seem to be these common components across the mystics, regardless of era and tradition, or whether they're Dominican or Franciscan, or Italian or German or whatever.
Yes. So I guess, going to the third part of what you were going to get at, looking at all of
right.
it. Yeah. What is some of the big takeaways?
So I think the unique value proposition that we offer is twofold. And this first point really goes back to what I was saying before, this assumption that if you have somehow direct contact with these texts, you'll somehow emerge really enlightened, versus if you read like a contemporary discourse on it by whatever it is, Evelyn Underhill or Richard Rohr, or someone unpacking these ideas, or say taking a course by Contemplative Light. But I really do think, unless you have like a seminary level education or some sort of graduate level, training in going through sort of textual analysis, it's a slog to get through this reading, even in modernized, translated form, to be able to kind of make sense of it and extract something useful, which is always what we've been about at Contemplative Light, is how can we give people tools and equip them to kind of move along on their spiritual journey. And so what I really think is, the first value proposition that we provide is condensed, concise, consolidated, accessible, intelligible, version of these teachings. And which is, if it's intimidating, the idea of approaching the mystics, maybe you take our course and one or two of them really jump out at you and you want to dive deeper in those. But we've done a good bit of the legwork in presenting an introduction, a kind of making, this is like a meet and greet. and we're connecting people in our audience and readership to these great mystics from the Christian tradition. And you'll get a feel for them, and you'll know kind of who speaks to you in your situation in life, or maybe this season in life. And I really think that's a big piece that we offer. Is we're not trying to present the scholarly analysis of these people, but try to provide some sense of who they were, some sense of their teaching in life, and in each case we give something, a couple quotes from their primary source, from their writing, that you can get a flavor and a sense and a taste of who they are. So we really want people to find who their sort of soul friend is among these mystics, and kind of make those connections. And so that's one certainly unique value prop that we offer. But then another one is, unlike a scholarly approach where, we report, you decide, we have the luxury as Contemplative Light of kind of giving our impression, our assessment, how these figures kind of fit into our understanding of the contemplative life. And so just like we have an introduction that situates these figures in context, and then we go through these 20 mystics from the Christian tradition, at the end, we do some quick hits and kind of evaluate and say, here's what struck me about this mystic. Here's what I found surprising. Here's someone who's writing I might go back to, and here's someone who's writing I might not go back to. And we have the luxury of really having an understanding as active contemplatives of who among these mystics we related to that kind of speak to our situation as contemporary contemplatives. And so those to me are two huge value props. One is this summary, and then on the other hand, this kind of evaluation, kind of a retrospective, and how we relate to these figures as active contemplatives, which in maybe a university setting, you're not necessarily going to get.
Yes, no, that's very well put, because I certainly, when I first started getting interested in Christian mystics, I wish I would have had something like this, because the only thing I came across that even came close was things in academia, which were definitely a more kind of distanced, impersonal perspective that was not from a fellow practitioner, but rather from a scholar. So it's a whole different thing, I think, when you're having practitioners. And needless to say, the whole thing is, none of this is unbiased. We've done this course because we think there's value in it, and we've chosen the mystics we chose because we liked them, So, really, everything we're doing, with this, we're doing because we think it's valuable. It's not like, the department said, hey, you got to teach a class on Christian mystics this year.
Right.
We're doing this because this has helped us. And another one more thing I do want to say too on that before we kind of close out this round of the discussion in this podcast episode is the fact that and I had a monk tell me this once, and it's always kind of made a lot of sense, that sometimes reading stories of mystics or saints and even getting to know their biographies can be a great way to kind of help you re-envision your own life, or bring some new juice to kind of understanding the shape of your own story and your own narrative, both past and present and in the future, maybe, because it kind of shows you what's possible. and shows you different ways people have lived. And, so, yeah, I think reading and just getting to know, like, the stories of these folks basically kind of helps you deepen the meaning and reframe your own story in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, I mean, thanks for this discussion. Anything else you want to add before we wrap this up?
I just want to kind of reintroduce this idea. I think when we made our first course, we had a partner at the time, Kimberly Holman, and she created this PowerPoint template that we were going to use, and she recorded this little intro in her kind of warm, kind of maternal voice that was like, we're a community of mystic and contemplative teachers that want to share our insight with you, but most importantly, our love. And so that was kind of a crystallized and articulated in such a clear, direct way, and in such a kind of texture and tone that was so warm and inviting that it kind of became a touchstone for me of kind of the purpose of what we do and why. And so I try to kind of, in my clunky, male way, include some sense of that in the course and in kind of sign-offs. So I just think the mystics, that's so central to them, and they kind of bring back kind of alignment and priority, that it really is all rooted in love and comes out of love as a kind of transformative quality of God kind of, drawing souls back to himself. And so whether you think of that literally or metaphorically. And so that's just one component I kind of, stumblingly try to include in so I almost wish I could play that at this point in the podcast so that people can kind of get a sense of what I feel is kind of the central purpose and thrust of whether it's a podcast or piece of writing or this course, that it's all kind of, that becomes the organizing principle of, that people get some kind of taste of that.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you said that. And, right on, I think that it really is all about love, and it's all about the love God has for us, the love we have for God, and the journey, and our love for everybody we're trying to reach and share these teachings and practices with, because it really kind of is the energy, I think, that runs through all things. And there's a quote from Leonard Cohen I love where, he says something to the effect of, "It is in love that we are made, in love we disappear." And, I really like that idea. And, yeah, so very well said. And, we'll continue our conversation about the Christian mystics, and as we get closer and closer to finishing up the course and releasing it to people. And I guess we'll talk again soon, Mark. And, have a good evening.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you.
All righty. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So I hope you enjoyed that talk that Mark and I had. And again, you can check out the course we have available now, which is basically more practice-centered. It's for the practice of contemplation, Christian meditation, different prayer methods. Going through all the stuff that mystics do. The kind of anyway, it's more the practical side, whereas the course coming up is just going to be more of the historical glimpse and an experiential glimpse of about 20 Christian mystics. So check us out, contemplativelight.com, and take care, my friends. So I hope you enjoyed that interview, and again, there's going to be a link to sign up for coaching. There's a very inexpensive initial consultation. If you're interested, the link is below, and thanks again for joining us.